The fire in the long gallery had burned down to ash by the time Charlotte Ashby understood what she was holding. She stood in the corridor outside her room, the folded paper still warm from the footman's hands, the single candle she carried throwing uncertain light across the handwriting she already knew could not be addressed to anyone else. Her name was there, in ink the color of river mud, 2 syllables rendered in a hand she had seen only on household account books, and a single amended invitation list. Lord Edmund Rayne, Earl of Westhaven, did not write letters to companions. Everyone in the house knew that. Charlotte had known it herself until this moment, when the evidence of the opposite sat between her fingers, and insisted. She did not open it in the corridor. She waited until the door was shut behind her and the candle was set on the writing table, and then she waited a moment longer, listening to the house settle around her in the particular silence of a winter night at Westhaven Park, when the 60 guests invited to Lady Dorothea's assembly ball had at last gone home, and the family had retired, and the only sound was the faint groan of the oak beams, responding to the cold, pressing in from outside. Then she broke the seal. What she did not yet know was that by the following evening, in front of those same guests reassembled in the same ballroom, a man would cross 40 feet of polished floor in 3 deliberate strides. And everything Lady Dorothea had spent the better part of a fortnight arranging would come apart with the quiet precision of a seam that had never been properly set. Charlotte had arrived at Westhaven Park on the 14th of November. Carried by a hired post-chaise, her brother Gerald had arranged at what she suspected was the minimum possible cost, given the state of Gerald's finances and his considerable relief at having solved what he consistently referred to as the difficulty of Charlotte's situation. The difficulty of Charlotte's situation was that she was 23 years old, unmarried, in possession of a modest education and no fortune whatsoever, and had recently declined a perfectly adequate offer from a solicitor in Ipswich whose perfectly adequate house she could have managed for the rest of her perfectly adequate life. Gerald had not forgiven her for it. Lady Dorothea Rayne, Dowager Countess of Westhaven, required a companion for the house party season, paid a stipend of £40 annually, and did not inquire too deeply into the companion's personal history. Gerald had written immediately. The house itself had silenced whatever objections Charlotte had been composing during the journey. Westhaven Park was built of honey-colored stone that the November light turned the color of old bone, enormous and self-possessed, set on a rise above a frozen lake whose edges had just begun to crust over in the early cold. There were servants in the drive who took her trunk without apparent interest in who owned it. There was a housekeeper, Mrs. Peake, a woman of 50, with an efficient manner, and eyes that took the full measure of a new arrival in approximately 4 seconds, who showed Charlotte to a room at the far end of the east wing that was not precisely cold, but would be, once the house settled properly into winter. Lady Dorothea takes her tea in the blue drawing-room at 10 o'clock, Mrs. Peake said, and departed. Lady Dorothea received Charlotte that first morning with the particular precision of a woman who had been assessing young women of uncertain means for 30 years and had developed the process into something nearly mechanical. She was seated in a high-backed chair upholstered in French blue silk, her silver hair dressed elaborately, a fan resting across her knee at an angle that suggested it was never entirely at rest. She wore 3 rings on her left hand and a pearl brooch of considerable age at her throat, and she examined Charlotte from her traveling dress to the hem of her second-best morning gown with the thoroughness of someone inspecting merchandise before committing to a price. "Miss Ashby," she said, "you will read to me after luncheon. I have a letter that requires answering this afternoon. You will not attend the evening entertainments unless specifically invited. The house party includes 14 guests over the next 3 weeks, and your role is not to constitute a distraction from those arrangements." She paused, and something shifted at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile. I trust your brother explained the nature of the position. Charlotte said that he had, and took the chair to which she was directed, and folded her hands in her lap, and understood with considerable clarity that this was the shape her days would take. The 14 guests arrived across the following 2 days in various conveyances, filling the house with the rustle and noise of a social world Charlotte existed alongside rather than inside. She learned their names from the arrangement of place cards she was asked to assist with, and their relationships from Mrs. Peake's spare annotations. Lord and Lady Forsyth, neighbors and allies. The Misses Hartwell, nieces on the late Earl's side. Mr. Crane, the family solicitor from London. A quiet man of 60 with ink-stained fingers, who arrived without luggage sufficient for a social visit, and was installed in the library immediately upon arrival. And Miss Vivian Selby, who came in a carriage that bore her family's crest on the panel, and who descended from it wearing a traveling costume of deep amber wool that made Charlotte, watching from the upper landing, think involuntarily of everything her own wardrobe was not. Miss Selby had dark hair dressed in the most current fashion, a laugh that carried across a room without effort, and a confidence in her own welcome that Charlotte recognized as the particular ease of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was precisely the right sort of person for any occasion she chose to enter. Lady Dorothea embraced Miss Selby at the front door. Lord Edmund arrived the following afternoon. Charlotte was in the gallery at the time, which ran the full length of the house's east wing, and contained, among the portraits of previous reigns and the mounted maps of the estate, a window seat sufficiently removed from the main rooms to constitute a small privacy. She had brought Thomas there. Thomas was 7 years old, the son of Edmund's younger brother George, who had died of a fever the previous March, and left his boy to Westhaven's household in the care of a series of nursemaids who tended to his physical requirements and ignored his considerably more urgent requirement to be spoken to, as if his observations had any value. Charlotte had discovered Thomas on the 3rd day of her stay, sitting outside the library door waiting for Mr. Crane to finish so he could ask him a question about maps, and she had sat down on the floor beside him to wait as well, and they had been in the habit of finding each other in the gallery since then. She was reading to him from a natural history of birds when she became aware that someone was standing in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. Thomas was in the middle of a thought about why herons stood on one leg, and Charlotte had learned already that interrupting him mid-thought produced a silence of considerable duration. She finished the sentence, closed the book over her finger, and glanced toward the door. The Earl of Westhaven was watching. He was taller than she had expected from the portrait in the dining room, and the portrait had not managed his stillness, which was the first thing she registered. That quality of complete arrest, as if the energy other men expended in perpetual motion had been compressed in him to something denser and more considered. He was not quite 35, she thought, though his face suggested he had arrived at his current expression from a considerable distance. His coat was travel-creased. He had not yet changed from the road. He had come directly to the gallery, and he was looking at Thomas with an attention that Charlotte would not have understood then had she been better positioned to read it, though she would understand it later. He did not come in. Thomas scrambled to his feet and said, "Uncle Edmund?" with the particular restraint of a child who has learned not to expect too much from reunions, and Edmund crossed the room in 4 strides and put one hand briefly on the boy's head and said, "You are well," in a voice that was level and deliberate and entirely without warmth in its surface register, and contained, Charlotte would think much later, everything that had no other place to go. He looked at her then. "Miss Ashby," he said. Mrs. Peake had evidently briefed him. "You are my mother's companion." "Yes, my lord," Charlotte said. He looked at the book in her hands. He looked at Thomas. He said nothing further. He turned and left the gallery, and Charlotte heard his boots on the stairs. And Thomas sat back down and said, "Will you read the part about the herons again?" And she did. He had stayed in the doorway for longer than courtesy required. She did not know then what to make of it. She filed it away in the category of things she had observed and was not permitted to act on, a category that had grown considerably since her arrival at Westhaven. Lady Dorothea voiced the label that evening at dinner, in the particular manner of a woman who knows she is being overheard and has arranged the sentence accordingly. Charlotte was not at the table. Companions did not dine with the party unless specifically invited, and she had not been specifically invited. She was returning a shawl to Lady Dorothea's room when she passed the dining room door, which had been left a degree ajar by some architectural caprice, and she heard Lady Dorothea's voice carrying clearly over the soup course, addressed apparently to Miss Selby and the women nearest her. Miss Ashby is a perfectly serviceable arrangement. Gerald Ashby's sister, from the Ipswich Ashbys, which is really quite ordinary. A solicitor's household, you understand. She reads well enough, and she does not make demands. One cannot ask for more in a companion. A pause, in which the clink of silver on china indicated polite attention from the assembled guests. "My only concern," Lady Dorothea continued, her voice dropping a careful half measure that ensured it carried equally, "is that she has a habit of forming opinions, and companions who form opinions are always a small inconvenience. We must simply hope she keeps them to herself." Miss Selby said something Charlotte could not quite hear, followed by a soft, general laughter. Charlotte stood in the corridor for the space of 3 quiet breaths, looking at the shawl in her hands, which was French cashmere of a quality she had never personally owned. Then she continued to Lady Dorothea's room, laid the shawl across the chair as instructed, and went back to the east wing and her own room and the natural history of birds, which she had been reading for herself rather than for Thomas, and found, on balance, to be quite good. She was a solicitor's daughter. She had grown up with her father's case files spread across the kitchen table when his study was too cold to work in, and she had learned to read documents before she learned to read novels, and she had formed opinions about both. Her father had not discouraged it. Gerald, who inherited neither their father's practice nor his temperament, had discouraged it extensively and to no observable effect. The Ipswich solicitor who had offered for her in September had described her, with what he seemed to feel was a compliment, as a woman of unusual perspicacity. And Charlotte had thanked him and declined. She had formed the opinion that Lord Edmund Rane had not wanted to leave the gallery, and she filed that away as well. The house party settled into its rhythms. Charlotte read to Lady Dorothea. She answered the letters Lady Dorothea dictated, in Lady Dorothea's hand and style, which she found not difficult to replicate once she had identified its governing principle, which was the maintenance of social authority at minimum visible cost. She attended to Thomas each afternoon in the gallery, or, when the weather permitted, on the south terrace where the boy had a particular interest in the frozen lake and whether it would bear weight by Christmas. She did not attend the evening entertainments. She was not invited. She saw Edmund at intervals that felt structured by some force neither of them had arranged. He appeared in the corridor near the library at the hour she returned Thomas to the nursery. He was present at the far end of the south terrace one morning when she and Thomas were watching a heron at the lake's edge, and he did not speak. But he stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the bird for 7 full minutes before going inside. He was occasionally in the library when she came to return books, and he said, on those occasions, things that were technically addressed to the matter of the book she was returning, but that lasted longer than the subject required, and in those extensions Charlotte heard, without quite knowing what to do with the hearing, something that was not coldness at all. Miss Selby voiced the label a second time in the morning room, 10 days into the party, without the discretion Lady Dorothea had exercised at dinner. Charlotte had come to the morning room to deliver a set of mended lace gloves that belonged to Lady Dorothea, and had arrived at the door just as Miss Selby, addressing 3 other young women arranged on the yellow settee, said, "I cannot imagine why Lady Dorothea requires a companion at all, with the family so fully occupied. Though I suppose a solicitor's daughter is preferable to a paid reader from the lending library. Barely. 1 grants." The 3 women on the settee produced the small sounds of social alignment. Miss Selby did not lower her voice when Charlotte entered, which was itself a kind of pronouncement. Charlotte set the gloves on the table beside Lady Dorothea's chair, said, "Good morning, Miss Selby," without inflection, and withdrew. She was not, precisely speaking, angry. She was something more contained than anger, something that occupied the same space anger would have filled and did not spill at the edges. She had learned this containment in Gerald's house, and before that in her father's house during the last 2 years of his illness, when the cost of the medicines and the cost of the failed investments and the final shape of the estate they would leave behind had required someone to hold the knowledge clearly without letting it become catastrophic. She had been 21. She had held it. She held this now. That same evening, Edmund did not sign the papers. Charlotte learned of it afterward, and not by his account. She had been crossing the hall near the library at 8:30 when she heard Mr. Crane's voice through the door, a tone of measured professional concern carrying over whatever response Edmund gave. She paused, not to listen, but because her foot had found an uneven board and she required a moment to rebalance, and in that moment, she heard Mr. Crane say, "The Forsyth arrangement would provide the boy a settled household, my lord, and the estate's obligations during the transition season are not inconsiderable." And Edmund say, with a flatness that she recognized now as the specific register he employed when he felt most precisely, "Thomas remains at Westhaven. I will sign nothing that moves him. George named me his guardian, and I will not manage that trust by calculating its inconvenience." A silence. "As you wish, my lord," Mr. Crane said. The board creaked under Charlotte's foot, and she moved away quickly, but not before she heard Edmund add, in a voice somewhat lower and addressed seemingly to himself as much as to the solicitor, "He trusted me. That much I will not fail." She told herself she had heard nothing and went to bed. 2 nights later, she gave Thomas her supper. The kitchen had sent no tray to the nursery that evening. Charlotte had not known this until she went to say good night and found the boy sitting on the floor beside his window with the particular stillness of a child who has learned not to complain about being forgotten, and she understood the situation in approximately 3 seconds. She went back to her own room, which was 3 doors down the corridor, and carried her supper tray to the nursery, and sat with Thomas while he ate it, and read to him from the bird book until he was drowsy enough to be put to bed without protest. She did not know Edmund was in the corridor. She did not know he had come to check on the boy himself, as he apparently did some evenings without announcement, a habit Mrs. Peake had mentioned once in passing, in the context of explaining why the nursery wing candles were always lit after 9 o'clock. She did not know he had stood in the corridor outside the open nursery door for the duration of the reading and the supper and the settling of the boy into his blankets. She did not know any of this until much later, when he told her. And even then she had not known what to say in response to the fact of it. What she knew was that she said good night to Thomas, who was asleep before she had pulled the door fully closed, and that she turned to find the corridor empty and the candles burning steadily, and the house around her carrying its usual winter quiet. The letter arrived the following evening. She had broken its seal and read it by the candle on her writing table, and then read it again, because the first reading had not seemed adequate to its contents. Edmund had not written a long letter. He had written, in a hand more careful than the household accounts, that he had observed her constancy with Thomas, that he recognized in her an accuracy of perception he had encountered in very few people, that the quality of her attention to the boy had been, in his word, restorative, and that he had found himself wishing, on several occasions, for the opportunity to speak to her without the occasion being the return of a book or a crossing of a corridor. He had written that he was uncertain of his right to wish anything of the sort. He had written nothing else, except his name. She read it 3 times. She put it under her pillow. She did not sleep for some time. When he found her in the gallery the next afternoon, he said, without preamble, "The letter was a mistake." Charlotte had been standing at the window that looked out over the frozen lake. Thomas was below on the south terrace with Mrs. Peake, conducting an investigation into the thickness of the ice at the edge. She turned from the window, and Edmund was 4 feet away, and the quality of his stillness was not the same as it usually was. It was tight, the way a thing is tight when it is containing pressure. "I should not have written it," he said. "It was an imposition. I ask you to disregard it." She looked at him for a moment. She had spent 23 years learning to disregard things. She had disregarded Gerald's assessment of her choices, and Lady Dorothea's assessment of her origins, and Miss Selby's assessment of her company. She had become, she privately acknowledged, quite accomplished at the disregarding of things she had been asked to not see. She was not going to disregard this. "I do not believe it was a mistake," she said. He said nothing. His jaw was set at the angle she had come to associate with his greatest effort of neutrality. "A mistake," she continued, with the care she applied to documents that required precise reading, "is something written in error. What you wrote was accurate. I could identify every observation you made, because I have made the same observations. You wrote them because you did not know what else to do with them, and I think, my lord, that you called it a mistake this afternoon because someone saw you in the corridor outside the nursery 3 nights ago, and you have been managing the implications since." He was very still. "Mrs. Peake," she said. She would not have meant any harm by mentioning it. A long pause in which the fire in the gallery grate shifted and settled. "You are extraordinarily direct," he said, not as a criticism. "My father was a country solicitor," she said. "He taught me to read what documents actually contain, not what their authors intended to conceal." Something happened in his face then. It was not dramatic. It was the equivalent of a single thread loosening in a tightly woven cloth, not enough to unravel anything, enough to show that the cloth had a different composition underneath than its surface suggested. He said, "George," and then stopped, and the word sat in the air between them, and Charlotte understood that it was not a beginning, but a completion, the end of something he had been carrying from the inside without any appropriate external form. "He gave me Thomas," Edmund said, after a silence that did not require filling. "In the last weeks. He wrote it into his will without telling me first, because he knew I would argue against it on the grounds that I was the worst possible choice. I was in London when he died. I had not gone back to Westhaven when he asked me to come. I had affairs. Business." He said the last word with a precision that indicated exactly what he thought of it as a justification. "I told myself there was time. There was not time." She did not offer him absolution for it. She recognized that absolution was not what was required. What was required was the specific acknowledgement that the weight had been heard. And she gave him that, in the only way she knew how, which was to stand still and not look away, and not reduce it to something that could be managed. He knew. You would not fail, Thomas, she said at last. He wrote the will accordingly. He looked at her then with an expression she could not yet name. He said, "Yes," quietly, as if the word cost something, and then said nothing else, and left the gallery. And Charlotte stood at the window for a long time watching Thomas on the terrace below. Miss Selby voiced the label the third time at the Westhaven Assembly Ball. The ball had been Lady Dorothea's arrangement since the autumn, a seasonal fixture that drew neighbors and the house party guests together in the long drawing room, cleared for dancing, with musicians from the village and enough candles to make the room genuinely warm. Charlotte had not expected to attend. The invitation came 2 hours before the event, delivered through Mrs. Peake with the information that Lady Dorothea required her companion present to assist with introductions and the management of seating. She wore her best dress, which was white muslin with a pale blue sash she had added herself, and she had no illusions about how it sat among the amber silk and the diamonds of Lady Dorothea's other guests, but she had learned enough from her father's documents to understand that the relevant quality was accuracy of bearing, not magnificence of material. She was standing near the far window, performing the invisibility her position required, when she heard Miss Selby's voice at her left, addressed to a woman Charlotte recognized as the wife of a neighboring landowner, a Mrs. Cavendish of sharp attentiveness and excellent recall. "One does feel for Lady Dorothea," Miss Selby said, with a sympathy calibrated to Carrie. "A companion is such a delicate matter. Miss Ashby is well-intentioned, I am sure, but she has formed a rather obvious attachment to the child in the nursery, which is the sort of thing that happens when women of that particular station mistake access for invitation." She smiled at Mrs. Cavendish, who was looking directly at Charlotte with an expression that had begun as polite attention and was becoming something more complicated. "She is a solicitor's daughter, playing at belonging. One cannot blame her. One simply cannot encourage it." 60 people moved through the long drawing room. The musicians played a country dance. The candles in the chandeliers did their patient, indifferent work. Charlotte looked at Miss Selby and said nothing, because her position required it, and she had mastered that requirement. And she held the held thing exactly as she had learned to hold it, and she counted, without quite meaning to, the cost of the holding. She went to Mr. Crane instead of to the window. He was standing at the edge of the room nearest the door, a man constitutionally unsuited to assembly balls and making no effort to conceal it, nursing a glass of wine and looking at the musicians with the expression of someone solving an unrelated problem in parallel. Charlotte positioned herself beside him with the directness her father had taught her was the correct approach to conversations that required clarity. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I understand you are Thomas's solicitor, as well as the estate's." He looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who does not expect to be addressed at social events by women he has not been introduced to, followed by a reassessment that she recognized as professional. "Lord Westhaven named me to manage the guardianship documents. Yes," he said carefully. "Then you are aware," she said, "that Lord Westhaven's refusal to sign the Forsyth arrangement has left Thomas's guardianship in the position of requiring a formal written confirmation of the current arrangement, which Lord Westhaven has not yet provided, and which, without it, leaves Thomas's position at Westhaven legally contingent rather than settled." Mr. Crane was quiet for a moment. He set his wineglass down. He looked at her with considerably more attention than he had managed before. "How do you know that?" he asked. "I read the relevant sections of the estate's document on the hall table the day after I arrived," she said. "My father was a country solicitor for 31 years. I understand entails and guardianship instruments. The gap in Thomas's documentation would allow a challenge if anyone chose to press it, and I believe Lady Dorothea does not fully understand the gap exists." He was still for a long moment. "Miss Ashby," he said, with deliberate quiet. What precisely are you telling me? I am telling you, she said, meeting his eyes steadily, that Lord Westhaven should be advised to complete Thomas's documentation before the party disperses, because without it, the boy's security at Westhaven is a matter of intention rather than law, and intention is not the same thing as protection. She paused. I am also aware that telling you this may be understood as inappropriate interference by a companion with no standing in this family, and that Lady Dorothea may consider it grounds to terminate my position. You are telling me anyway, he said. Thomas is 7 years old, she said. He has lost both his parents and his home at Ravenwick, and he waits outside library doors, hoping someone will answer his questions about maps. Yes, Mr. Crane, I am telling you anyway. She excused herself and went back to the window. She did not see Edmund at first. She was watching the dancing, which had passed through 2 country dances and arrived at something more sedate, and she was managing, with her usual efficiency, the accumulated weight of the evening. When she saw him, she almost failed to recognize, at first, what was happening. He was at the far end of the room, near the musicians, speaking to Lady Dorothea and Miss Selby, and Lady Dorothea was in the middle of something that had the structure and confidence of an arrangement being confirmed. Miss Selby's hand was on Edmund's arm. Lady Dorothea's fan was at its elevated angle. The moment had the quality of a conclusion being reached. Edmund looked across the room. He found her without any apparent searching, as if he had known precisely where she was. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, which in a room of 60 people and active dancing was a social event of its own modest order. Then he looked at his mother and said something brief and stepped back, and Miss Selby's hand was no longer on his arm. Lady Dorothea's expression did not change. It was the expression of a woman recalculating. He crossed the room. It was not a dramatic crossing. He did not rush. He walked at the measured pace of a man who is accustomed to rooms turning their attention to him and has learned to give that attention nothing to feed on. But 40 feet of polished floor was 40 feet of polished floor, and 60 people saw him cross it, and 60 people recognized the direction and the destination, and the music continued its patient work while the room made, in aggregate, the small sounds of social attention realigning. Charlotte stood with her hand still, and the white muslin dress doing its honest best, and her father's education providing the steadiness her own chest was not managing entirely. He stopped in front of her. He said, Miss Ashby, Charlotte. Both names, as if one was for the room and one was for her, and she understood the distinction. I am told I owe Thomas a completed document. I am told the advice came from you. I should have seen the gap myself. You have had other concerns, she said. I have had, he said, the particular blindness of a man who has confused the intention of a thing with its proper execution. He said it in the level, deliberate voice she had learned, across these weeks, to read beneath. He was not talking only about legal documents. My brother knew you would have seen it. I begin to think he would have approved of the correction. Lady Dorothea had moved to within 20 feet. Charlotte could see her in the edge of her attention. The fan held precisely. The recalculation ongoing. The confidence of the last fortnight encountering something it had not planned for, which was her son's deliberate crossing of 40 feet of floor in front of 60 witnesses. Your Grace, Lady Dorothea said, and caught herself because he was an earl and not a duke, and the slip was small, but it had been heard, and she heard it too, and something in the precision of her bearing contracted very slightly, the way an instrument contracts in unexpected cold. Edmund, Miss Selby is waiting. Miss Selby is an excellent young woman, Edmund said without turning from Charlotte. "And she deserves a man whose primary concern when he enters a room is her. I am not that man." A silence. Miss Selby, who had followed at the edge of the reorienting crowd and heard this clearly, showed, for one unguarded moment, something that was neither humiliation nor relief, but a complicated mixture of the two that Charlotte recognized, with a sympathy she had not expected to feel, as the expression of a woman who has been performing the correct script for a very long time and has just been told the production is closing. She composed herself within the same moment, turned, and moved back toward the yellow settee with a dignity that cost her something, and which Charlotte, to her own surprise, found she respected. Lady Dorothea said, "This is neither the time nor the place." "I disagree," Edmund said, and now he turned, with the quietness of a man who has spent 35 years being measured and deliberate, and has chosen, on this specific occasion, to be that without any of the cold armor that normally accompanied it. "This room is precisely the place, because this room is where you arranged the appearance of a settled matter that was not mine to settle on your schedule." He spoke without volume and without cruelty, and the room heard him anyway, because rooms hear what a man of his rank says when he means it, and does not trouble himself to lower his voice. "Miss Ashby will be respected in this house. I am making that a matter of public record, here, now, in front of anyone who cares to note it." Lady Dorothea held her fan at its accustomed height for 3 more seconds. Then it lowered, by perhaps 2 inches, which in the language of her bearing was considerable. She looked at Charlotte with an expression that was recalculating in a new direction, no longer the precision instrument of dismissal, something more complicated and less certain. She said, "I see," which was not capitulation and was not agreement, and was all that the moment required. Mr. Crane appeared at Edmund's elbow with the composure of a solicitor who has been waiting for the appropriate moment and has identified it. He said, "My lord, if you have a quarter of an hour before the evening concludes, I believe we can settle Thomas's documentation tonight." And Edmund said, "Yes," and looked at Charlotte once more, and she saw in his face what she had been reading between the lines of the letter she had not yet returned. He had meant every word of it. She had known that from the first reading. She had known it from the texture of the erasures and corrections she had found in 2 places, where he had started a sentence and stopped and begun again more carefully. The traces of revision that a man makes only when he is trying to be exact about something that matters. She had been a solicitor's daughter reading a legal document, and the document had told her what its author was attempting, at considerable disciplinary cost, to say. The musicians played a final set. The guests gathered their wraps and their partners and their reconsidered impressions. Mrs. Cavendish, passing Charlotte near the door, paused and said, with a directness Charlotte recognized as a compliment from a woman of that particular formation, "Your father taught you well, Miss Ashby," and passed on before Charlotte could determine how to respond. The house settled into its later quiet. The candles were extinguished in the long drawing room. The fire in the library burned down. Edmund and Mr. Crane sat at the library table until 11:30, and Charlotte knew this because she passed the library door carrying Thomas, who had woken confused and needed returning to his bed, and she heard the scratch of a pen and Edmund's voice and Mr. Crane's confirming responses. And she carried the boy up the nursery stairs with the knowledge that by morning the documentation would exist, and Thomas's position at Westhaven would be law rather than intention. She returned to her own room and took the letter from beneath her pillow, where she had replaced it each morning and from which she had retrieved it each evening, and read it again in the candlelight with the knowledge, now, of what the next weeks would bring, and what would be required of her, and what she was prepared, on the evidence of everything she had observed, to give. The letter was not a mistake. She had said so once. And she was right. And she knew she was right in the particular way she had learned from her father's documents. When every clause, read in order, leads to the same conclusion, you are holding an honest piece of work. She would not return it. She would keep it. By the morning, the house party had begun its dispersal. Lord and Lady Forsyth departed after breakfast with warm expressions directed, Charlotte noticed, no longer toward Miss Selby's orbit, but toward a more considered center of the room's attention. The Misses Hartwell said their goodbyes with the cheerful confusion of women whose social map had been lightly rearranged overnight. Miss Selby departed in the Ambercrest carriage before 10 o'clock with her luggage, and her considerable composure restored to a working approximation of its usual condition. And Charlotte wished her, sincerely, the good fortune she deserved with someone who would mean it. Gerald arrived 4 days later to inquire after Charlotte's situation, having received a letter from Lady Dorothea that he described as somewhat cryptic. He was shown into the blue drawing-room, where Lady Dorothea received him with her customary precision and her fan at its accustomed height, and where Edmund was also present, which Gerald had evidently not anticipated. Charlotte sat in the chair to which she had been directed on her first morning at Westhaven, and watched her brother make the rapid social calculation that men in his position made when they entered a room and found its arrangement substantially different from what their intelligence had prepared them for. Gerald was not a perceptive man, but he was a practical one. He understood, within approximately 40 seconds, that the situation had shifted, and he aligned himself with the shift without requiring it to be explained to him in detail, which Charlotte thought was probably his most useful quality, and the one that had served him best across a life of following the direction of the prevailing wind. He left after lunch, the difficulty of Charlotte's situation having resolved itself in a manner he had not arranged and could not take credit for, which she suspected would bother him for some years. Edmund found her in the gallery that evening. She was at the window again, the lake below just visible in the fading December light, the ice now thick enough that Thomas had stood on its edge that afternoon under Mrs. Peake's anxious supervision and pronounced it satisfactory. The house was quieter by 5 guests. The remaining occupants were the family, Mr. Crane, who would depart in the morning, and Charlotte, whose stipend and position were in the process of being reconsidered by all parties. Edmund stood beside her at the window. He did not look at the lake. He looked at the gallery's reflection in the glass, which gave him, Charlotte thought, a view of her profile without the direct address that both of them were, apparently, managing toward from slightly different angles. "Mr. Crane has confirmed Thomas's guardianship documents," he said. "The boy is here as a matter of law, not simply my preference." "I am glad," she said. "Charlotte." He said her name with the deliberateness she had heard at the ball, the tone of a man who has made a decision and has no interest in surrounding it with ceremony it does not require. "I did not write that letter as a mistake. I wrote it because I could not find another form for what it contained. And then I panicked, which is undignified, and which I would prefer you not mention to Mr. Crane." A pause, in which she heard something that was not quite a breath. "I wrote it because George would have told me to. Because George understood that the particular variety of my blindness requires a woman who reads documents as they are, rather than as they are presented." She turned from the window. He was looking at her now, not at the reflection, and the distance between them was 2 feet of gallery air and whatever remained of the arrangement they had each been maintaining for the past 3 weeks, which was not, she found, very much at all. "I am not a suitable match by any measure your mother would recognize," she said, because accuracy required it. "My mother," he said, "is reconsidering several of her measures. She will not say so directly for at least a fortnight. She will arrive at an opinion that she has always thought well of country solicitors, particularly the Ipswich variety, and she will hold that opinion sincerely from approximately February onward. He said this without a smile, but the region around his eyes contained something that was not his usual discipline, and Charlotte recognized it as the nearest thing to warmth he had managed in her direct presence, which was warmer than he perhaps knew. I am asking, Charlotte, not arranging. Asking. She looked at him for a long moment with the full accuracy of attention she had brought to every document her father had laid before her, and every observation she had filed, and every held thing she had carried across the years of learning to hold things correctly. She said yes. December moved into its final weeks. The snow that had been threatening since Charlotte's arrival came at last, falling in the way it falls on estates of considerable age, as if the house has been expecting it and has made arrangements. Thomas stood at the nursery window with the patient intensity of a child for whom weather is a serious subject, and Charlotte stood beside him. And below them, the park was becoming the still white version of itself that it would be until March. Edmund's study fire burned. The letter sat in the drawer of Charlotte's writing table, returned from under the pillow to a place that was both safer and more permanent. Mr. Crane had gone back to London with his ink-stained fingers and his completed documents, and a letter of thanks from Edmund that Charlotte had not written, which meant it was shorter than most letters she had written for the household, and considerably more direct. Lady Dorothea, true to Edmund's prediction, appeared at breakfast one morning and remarked that Charlotte's father must have been a thorough man, because she had always found thoroughness to be the most reliable quality in any professional engagement, and Charlotte said that he had been, and poured the tea. On the evening of the 21st of December, Edmund brought Charlotte the letter she had written to Gerald 5 years before, which she had not known he had recovered from the bundle of her father's papers that Gerald had sent with her trunk, and then apparently redirected to Edmund's own study, with the particular administrative confusion that characterized Gerald's management of most things. It was a letter she had written at 21, in the last months of her father's illness, detailing the estate's obligations and her proposed management of them, which she had then considered too forthright to send, and had filed among her father's documents instead. Edmund held it out to her with the expression of a man presenting evidence. "You wrote the entail notation in the margin in your own hand," he said. "Not your father's. You saw it before he did. Gerald's solicitor in London found it in the bundle and sent it to me because my name was in the estate correspondence." She took the letter from him and looked at it. The familiar handwriting of her 21-year-old self. The marginal note she had added in the small clear script that her father had taught her was the only acceptable form for legal annotation. "You read my private correspondence," she said. "I read an accurate legal document," he said, with the precise echo she recognized as intentional. "I have my father's habits as well." She looked up at him, and he was close, and the fire in his study was warm, and the snow outside the window was doing its patient, indifferent work on the park, and the frozen lake, and the iron gates at the long drive's end. He had meant the letter. Every word, as she had known from the first reading, every correction and revision, every clause that led in the same direction. She kept both letters. The fire burned steadily in the hearth that evening, and Thomas slept in the nursery 1 floor above. And somewhere in the house, Lady Dorothea was composing a letter to her sister in Bath that would describe the season's arrangements in terms somewhat different from what she had originally planned. And outside, the snow came down on Westhaven Park in the unhurried way of snow that expects to stay. If Charlotte's story found something in you that you recognize, leave a thought in the comments. The quiet ones in the back of the room always have the most worth sharing. Charlotte held the older letter by the candle for a moment, then folded it carefully alongside the other, and set them both in the writing table's drawer, and listened to the snow. She was home.